what we're talking about is authoritarianism. We could have talked about Pol Pot. We could have talked about authoritarians across history. I chose something I know very well. I helped to build a Holocaust museum. And what I know is in the early days of the Nazi regime, they started slowly but surely taking away people's rights. And what we're seeing now is the very same thing.
Strong language from Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker there. He was speaking on the deployment of ICE and federal law enforcement to Chicago and the threats Trump has made to send National Guard troops to the city as part of his crackdown on crime. Here's a little more of what Pritzker had to say.
They've gone into cities now with the military. Think about that. In your lifetime, have you ever seen anything like that, where the President of the United States is sending military or troops dressed as military, ICE and CBP, in camouflage with automatic weapons into our major cities? It's wrong. And indeed, especially at a time when it's the President of the United States who's causing the mayhem on the ground. He's the one taking funding away from law enforcement, taking funding away from victims, taking money away from community violence intervention. I mean, who is it here that's standing up for the rights of our people?
Yesterday, during a Senate committee hearing, Attorney General Pam Bondi indicated that troops are already on their way to Chicago. We'll get to her testimony later in this show. But meantime, President Trump says he wouldn't rule out invoking the Insurrection Act to deploy more troops to U.S. cities and allow them to directly arrest people.
Well, it's been invoked before, as you know. If you look at Chicago, Chicago's a great city where there's a lot of crime. And if the governor can't do the job, we'll do the job. It's all very simple. They probably had 50 murders in Chicago over the last 5, 6, 7 months. Many people were shot. And then the governor gets up and he says, well, we can handle it. They can't handle it. They don't know what they're doing. The mayor is grossly incompetent.
That law has not been invoked since 1992 during the LA riots. I want to start with what J.B. Pritzker said because I think he ought to be ashamed of himself. I mean, we have a moment after the assassination of Charlie Kirk. There was a man arrested over the weekend with 200 handmade explosives outside of a red mass for SCOTUS justices who had expressed anti-ICE, anti-SCOTUS things in his writings that he gave to police. We had Jay Jones texting people in 2022 fantasizing about the murder of his political opponent, and the Kavanaugh assassin appearing in court and getting a light sentence because of his transgender identity, when attempted assassins would typically get 30 years or even life in prison. And Democrats have been saying that we need to tone down the rhetoric, and yet here's J.B. Pritzker likening the Trump administration to Nazis. It's disgusting.
Yeah, I actually agree. I think that the overuse of likening or using the word fascist and using Gestapo administration, likening people to Nazis, I think it's been abused and disgustingly overused over the last few years, so much that it's almost like a punchline. And then there are Jewish people all over the country that are kind of like, I can't imagine if everything was likened to slavery. You know, as a black person in this country, that would be extremely upsetting. So we constantly use that term and everything is so dramatic when really a conversation is just needed. And perhaps you do think Trump is going too far, but I don't think that we're going to turn into Nazi Germany. I don't think this is the worst of times. We talked about that on Friday, right? And so, you know, I think with that said and that put aside, that I completely condemn constantly comparing those things. The overwhelming abuse of power here when it comes to looking at local cities, particularly when it comes to crime, because I know Robbie and I and you and I always talk about how that immigration is a federal issue. So when we're talking about crime, we've even had Megyn Kelly say, I don't think it's appropriate. I never agree, she said, with J.B. Pritzker, but President Trump sending troops in or a National Guard to deal with crime is not the solution. And I also agree that over-militarizing our cities is not the way to solve crime. I also agree that, like D.C., Chicago certainly can use assistance in figuring out how to bring crime down in every city. My first concern was that we started with D.C., which I know is an anomaly when it comes down to how to deal with locations because they have a different relationship with the federal government. But I think when he just nitpicked other places, like didn't start with Memphis, which, you know, or other places in Tennessee that have some of the biggest crime places, and automatically went to Chicago, pinpointed Baltimore or Detroit, it just kind of felt random based on Democratic leaderships. And I think that the conversation should happen with where is the most crime? Where is the quote unquote national emergency that would warrant national troops going in? And then where's the conversation with local government, mayors, governors, and saying, how do we solve this? Because I've heard governors and mayors of many cities say, yes, even right here in DC, Mayor Bowser saying we could use more funding for our police force. We certainly could use help in these areas. But I think when you just kind of strong arm and make a decision as the president versus having a dialogue with this leadership to figure out long-term solutions, not only do you put a Band-Aid on a crime problem that will just come back because people maybe are fearful that they see armed uniforms in the streets more often, but when you go away, what happens? And the long-term solution is not to have our National Guard sitting in local cities across America. That's not going to be the way that anyone wants to live.
So Trump has talked about sending the National Guard into blue cities in red states like Memphis and St. Louis, and those governors obviously are willing to work with him on that plan. Chicago, to me, is a little bit of a different animal because in the past week, we have seen the deliberate impeding of federal immigration officers by protesters and rioters in the city, including several people who have rammed or blocked in ICE vehicles. We saw hundreds of people surrounding ICE vehicles as they were trying to take detainees away from certain areas. And so if you are impeding federal law enforcement, then you don't have a states' rights argument anymore because they have to be free to carry out those duties. And if they're not, then I think the president absolutely has the legal authority to send in the National Guard to make sure that those riots are suppressed.
We certainly don't need community vigilantes. I get it. People think they're doing the right thing or maybe trying to say this is not the right cause, but anytime you're going against law enforcement as a civilian is a disaster, right? That they have they're actually trained to protect themselves. And so I don't think that that's going to be a good solution either. But I know that the temperature and the climate is heightened for some people in that community relationship element because of the presence of ICE in these communities. And ICE, the people working for ICE are not in the wrong. They're doing their job, right? They've been sent there by the federal government. But the friction is there that people are just like I know that there was a report about parents who were picking up their children and saw ICE like somewhere in the vicinity. And so they kind of made a blockade to make sure that the kids just get directly on the bus or to their parents' cars because they're not trying to impede ICE. They just also don't want to create an environment of fear for young kids. You're taking away their innocence in certain ways. And so people are collateral damage of this. Not everybody that's Latino or who may look or sound or feel like a migrant is. They're migrants from all different races. And I think that the idea that people are on alert in these cities and there's a more succinct way to handle this is some of the argument coming from the Democratic side that this is not the way forward. Well, maybe we can get, if you want to make immigration a policy, let's go through Congress and put a policy in place about how we're going to work this out throughout the country. But just strong arming and sending the military in is not the way forward.
Well, the problem with going through Congress is that inevitably there's always these immigration reform bills that don't require deportations on a mass level before they allow amnesty or a certain number of border crossings like we saw with the so-called bipartisan border bill during the Biden administration. And so I think Republicans are just done with that. Like they feel like they've been sold up a river every time that they do a comprehensive immigration reform bill. It always leads to amnesty. And I also think Democrats lose the argument when they say, well, we want this to be done in a more discreet manner that doesn't bring fear to communities when they are deliberately not cooperating with ICE. If they were cooperating, then their local police could keep people detained and held for ICE to come pick them up at jails. But because they're not doing that, ICE has no choice but to go into the community and actually round people up themselves.
But the large majority of migrants aren't even criminals. And so when we're talking about going into these cities, we're getting rid of farmers, which Republicans and people who voted for Trump have complained about in Pennsylvania and Los Angeles and throughout California. Like we're taking people who were just civilians and working, which Joe Rogan was bringing up in an earlier segment. People are actually being in fear of their life. Is that the environment that we want to create for people that are helping our economy? In many ways, and many could argue, it's like there are big businesses that rely, even President Trump's businesses in the past have relied on immigrant labor. And so I know there are two schools of thoughts. Get every single immigrant out of this country that came here illegally. Okay, you're that. And then there's other school of thought of like Robbie's school of thought is very much like, let's get the criminals out of here. And everybody agrees on the criminal piece, but everyone doesn't agree on the other piece. So why are we pressing forward with that agenda when the whole country?
Well, it was what he promised on the campaign trail was mass deportations. They said they were going to prioritize the criminals, but that was never an indication that they weren't going to deport other people as well.
This is going to keep happening, I know, so we'll be talking about it.
We will. Attorney General Pam Bondi testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee yesterday. We'll have more on the combative hearing coming up next. Stay with us.